The champagne glass slipped from Lucia Alberini's fingers and shattered against the marble floor of the Sovrano Grand Ballroom, but nobody rushed to help her. 300 of the city's wealthiest guests turned to stare, and for one endless moment, Lucia stood frozen in her sapphire gown, feeling every year of her 58 years pressing down on her like a judgment she never asked for. Her husband of 39 years, Massimo Alberini, stood a few feet away with his hand still raised, the hand that had just pushed her back from the crowd as though she were an unwelcome stranger instead of his wife. His face was not embarrassed on her behalf. It was embarrassed of her. "You shouldn't have come, Lucia," he had said, low and sharp, gripping her elbow hard enough to bruise. "This isn't the place for you tonight." She had asked him what he meant. She had asked him why, after 39 years, he was looking at her the way a man looks at a stain on his sleeve. And that was when the young woman appeared at his side, sliding a slender arm through his like she had done it 100 times before, her laughter bright and careless, her dress a shade of gold that seemed to apologize for nothing. Lucia did not need anyone to explain who she was. She read it in the way Massimo did not pull away. She read it in the way the room around them seemed to already know, the way old friends suddenly found their shoes fascinating and business partners suddenly needed the bar. Lucia had spent hours getting ready for that night. She had chosen the sapphire gown because it was the one Massimo used to say brought out the color in her eyes, back when he still noticed the color of her eyes. She had curled her silver-streaked hair and stood in front of the mirror telling herself that showing up uninvited, showing up in the middle of a secret she was never supposed to discover, might still somehow end in an apology instead of a spectacle. She had been wrong. She had been wrong about so many things. The humiliation did not come all at once. It came in pieces, the way heartbreak always does. It came in the silence of the guest who once called her a dear friend. It came in the pity in some eyes and the amusement in others. It came in Massimo's refusal to say one single word in her defense, not even a whisper, not even a lie to save her dignity in front of strangers. 39 years of packed lunches, of sleepless nights with sick children, of standing beside him through 2 bankruptcies and 1 heart attack, of believing in a man before the rest of the world believed in him. None of it seemed to matter now that her hair had gone silver and her hands had begun to show their age. Lucia turned before the tears could fall in front of everyone. She walked toward the towering doors of the ballroom with her chin lifted, though her heart was breaking with every step, because if there was one thing 39 years of marriage had taught her, it was how to walk away from a room with her back straight even when everything inside her was collapsing. She had nearly reached the doors when a voice stopped her, calm and unhurried, a voice that did not belong to anyone who had watched the scene with pity or amusement. "May I have this dance?" If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories like this one to life, and there is a lot more of Lucia's story still to come. Lucia turned, expecting another curious guest wanting a closer look at the woman who had just been humiliated by her own husband. Instead, she found herself looking into the steady, dark eyes of a man she recognized instantly, though they had never once spoken. Antonio Moetti. 60 years old, silver at the temples, dressed in a black suit so simply cut it somehow outshone every tailored jacket in the room. Everyone in the city knew his name. Some spoke it with fear, remembering the empire he had once commanded in his younger years. Others spoke it with quiet respect, remembering the discreet, generous man he had become since stepping back from that life. Nobody in that ballroom, including Massimo, dared to look him directly in the eye. Antonio was not looking at her the way the rest of the room had looked at her. He was not looking at a foolish, aging wife who had embarrassed herself by showing up somewhere she wasn't wanted. He was looking at her the way a man looks at someone he has quietly admired from a distance for a very long time. "I don't dance, Signor Moetti," Lucia said softly, her voice unsteady despite her best effort to hold it together. "Not tonight." "Then dance with me for one song," he answered, his hand still extended, patient and unshaken by her refusal, "and let this room remember you as something other than what just happened to you." Behind her, she could feel Massimo watching, could feel the young woman in gold watching, could feel 300 pairs of eyes waiting to see what she would do next. Lucia looked down at Antonio Moetti's open hand, then up at his face, and for the first time all evening, she saw something she had not seen from her own husband in years. She saw someone who actually saw her. Lucia had not danced with anyone in almost a decade. Massimo used to say dancing was for people with nothing better to do with their evenings, and somewhere along the way she had believed him, the same way she had believed so many small things he said about who she should be. But when Antonio Moetti placed his hand gently against her waist and led her into the first slow turn across the ballroom floor, she felt something she had not felt in years. She felt like a woman again, not a wife who had outlived her usefulness. He did not ask her questions about what had just happened. He did not offer pity or false comfort. He simply danced with her, unhurried and steady, while the room around them buzzed with whispers neither of them acknowledged. When the song ended, he walked her to the door himself, past Massimo, past Chiara, past every curious face in that ballroom, and he did not once look back to see how they were reacting. Only Lucia mattered to him in that moment, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she believed it. To understand why Antonio Moetti had crossed that ballroom for a woman he had never formally met, one had to go back nearly 30 years, to a small house on the edge of the city where a much younger Lucia had lived 2 doors down from a woman named Serena Moetti. In those days, Antonio's name was already known and already feared in certain circles, but none of that mattered to Lucia when she noticed Serena struggling to carry her groceries one autumn afternoon, thin and pale from an illness the neighborhood only spoke of in hushed voices. Lucia had knocked on Serena's door the very next morning with a pot of soup and had kept knocking, week after week, long after it became clear that Serena's illness would not be cured. She sat with her during the worst nights. She held her hand when the doctors ran out of things to try. She never once asked Antonio for anything in return, and in fact, she barely spoke to him at all in those years, always careful to give the grieving husband his space. Antonio never forgot it. Men in his world were used to loyalty bought with fear or money, and Lucia's kindness toward Serena had cost her nothing to give and asked for nothing back. After Serena passed, Antonio quietly withdrew from the life he had built, handing his businesses to men he trusted and stepping into a slower, more private existence. But he kept track of Lucia from a distance over the years, the way a man keeps track of the rare kindness that once mattered to him, never intruding, never announcing himself. He had also, some 12 years earlier, quietly saved Massimo's company from collapse. Few people in the city knew the truth of how Alberini Holdings had survived its darkest financial year, and Massimo certainly did not know that the mysterious investors who bought his failing debt at a critical hour had been guided by Antonio Moetti's hand, acting through intermediaries who never once mentioned his name. Antonio had done it for Lucia, quietly, without any expectation of thanks, because he could not bear to see the woman who had shown his dying wife such tenderness lose the modest, hopeful life she had once described to Serena in passing conversation. None of this history mattered to Lucia as she stepped into the cool night air outside the Sovrano Grand Ballroom, her heels in her hand and her sapphire gown catching the wind. She did not know any of it. She only knew that a stranger with a quiet, steady voice had made her feel, for 4 minutes on a dance floor, like the humiliation of the evening did not define her. "Might I offer you a ride home, Signora Alberini?" Antonio asked, standing a respectful distance away near a black car that had appeared as though summoned by instinct rather than instruction. Lucia hesitated. Going home with a stranger, however gentlemanly, was not something a woman of her upbringing did lightly, and there was still a part of her, wounded and uncertain, that wondered if this whole evening had been some elaborate cruelty dressed up as kindness. But something in Antonio's patient stillness told her otherwise. "I'll call my own car, thank you," she said carefully, though her voice had softened. "But thank you for the dance, Signor Moetti. You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," Antonio said simply. "A woman like you shouldn't leave a room like that alone, forgotten in a corner while everyone else pretends not to see." He did not ask for her number. He did not press for more conversation. He simply gave a small, respectful bow of his head and returned to his car, leaving Lucia standing beneath the golden lights of the Sovrano entrance, watching his taillights disappear into the city traffic, wondering why a man she had never met had looked at her with more warmth in 4 minutes than her husband had shown her in the last 4 years. She did not yet know that this would not be the last time their paths crossed. She only knew, walking to her own car alone that night, that for the first time since she could remember, she did not feel invisible. 3 weeks passed before Lucia saw Antonio Moetti again, and when she did, it was by accident, or so it seemed at the time. She was sitting alone at a small cafe near the Botanical Gardens, a place she had started visiting in the morning simply to have somewhere to go that did not remind her of the house she now shared with a husband who barely looked at her. She had just ordered her coffee when a familiar, unhurried voice spoke from behind her. "Is this seat taken, Signora Alberini?" Lucia turned, startled, to find Antonio standing beside the empty chair across from her, dressed simply in a grey sweater instead of the tailored suit she remembered from the gala, looking somehow both powerful and at ease in a way few men managed. She should have said no. She should have remembered that she was still, on paper, a married woman, and that sitting with another man in public was the kind of thing that could feed gossip she did not have the strength to fight. But there was something about his presence that felt safe rather than dangerous, and before she fully decided to, she found herself gesturing to the empty chair. "Not taken," she said. Though I imagine a man like you doesn't often find himself at cafes by the gardens. I find myself wherever I please these days, Antonio said, settling into the chair with the same unhurried grace he carried into every room. Retirement has its privileges. They spoke for nearly an hour that morning, about nothing important and everything important all at once. Antonio asked about her garden, and Lucia found herself talking for the first time in years about the roses she used to grow before Massimo decided the backyard needed a pool instead. He asked about her children, both grown now and living in other cities, and she spoke of them with a pride that lit up her whole face. He did not ask about Massimo, and she did not offer anything about him, and somehow that silence between them said more than words could have. It became, without either of them quite naming it, a routine. Some mornings he was there when she arrived. Some mornings she arrived to find he was not, and she was surprised by how disappointed that made her feel. He never pressured her for more than conversation. He never touched her hand, never said anything a married woman could not have repeated to her own husband without shame. He simply showed up, again and again, offering the one thing Massimo had stopped offering years ago, his full, undivided attention. Meanwhile, in the tower offices of Alberini Holdings, the world Massimo had built with such pride was beginning to show cracks he refused to acknowledge. Chiara Rinaldi, 29 years old and dazzling in every room she entered, had been drawn to Massimo initially for reasons that were not entirely about his wealth, though she would not have admitted that even to herself. She had been a junior associate at his firm 2 years earlier, ambitious and hungry for a mentor, and Massimo's attention had felt, at first, like validation of everything she was working toward. But as the months wore on and the affair deepened into something more permanent, Chiara began to notice things she had not expected to notice. Massimo did not speak of the future with her the way he once spoke of his early years with Lucia, the years he still, in unguarded moments, described with a warmth he never seemed to summon for anything happening in his life now. He grew tired more easily. He grew short-tempered over small mistakes. And most troubling to Chiara, whose own ambitions had never been small, his business decisions had begun to feel less like the calculated brilliance that once built his empire and more like the desperate choices of a man trying to prove something to himself. The Gala scandal had not helped. Word of what happened to Lucia Alberini had spread through the city's social circles with the particular cruelty reserved for men who are caught being unkind in public, and several of Massimo's oldest business partners had grown noticeably cooler toward him in the weeks that followed. A man who could humiliate the wife who built his empire beside him, they whispered, was a man whose word could not be trusted in a boardroom either. Massimo told himself none of it mattered. He told himself Chiara's youth and Chiara's admiration were worth whatever whispers followed him through the city. But some nights, alone in the mansion that had once been full of Lucia's laughter and was now full of nothing but the hum of empty rooms, he found himself staring at old photographs he had not thrown away, wondering, in moments he would never admit to anyone, whether he had traded something irreplaceable for something that would not last. He did not yet know that the woman he had humiliated was, 3 miles across the city, learning to laugh again over coffee with a man who saw her exactly as she was. By the time autumn settled fully over the city, Lucia had begun to notice changes in herself that she had not expected. She stood a little straighter now when she walked into a room. She laughed more easily, and more often, and she had started, almost without meaning to, tending to an old friendship she had let fade during the busiest years of Massimo's career. Her friend Donatella, who had known her since they were both young brides with more hope than money, remarked one afternoon over lunch that Lucia looked 10 years younger than she had at Donatella's granddaughter's christening the previous spring. "It's not the face cream," Donatella said, studying her with the sharp affection of an old friend. "Something has changed in you, Lucia. Tell me his name." Lucia laughed, waving the suggestion away, though a warmth crept into her cheeks that she could not entirely explain. "There's no name, Donatella. I've simply remembered what it feels like to matter to someone." It was not entirely a lie. Antonio had never once suggested romance in their weeks of cafe conversations and quiet walks through the botanical gardens. He asked nothing of her beyond her company, and yet in his presence, Lucia found herself remembering who she had been before 39 years of accommodating another person's ambitions had worn away at the edges of her own identity. She began painting again, something she had abandoned in her 20s when Massimo told her, gently at the time but firmly, that it was an impractical hobby for a woman who needed to focus on building a household. She joined a small book club that met on Thursday evenings. She started sleeping in the guest room at home, not out of anger, but because she had finally stopped waiting for Massimo to notice she was gone from their bed. Massimo did notice, eventually, though not in the way Lucia might have hoped. He noticed the empty side of the bed and felt, for the first time in years, something like unease rather than relief. He noticed that Lucia no longer asked where he had been or why he came home late, and instead of feeling free of her scrutiny, he found the silence unsettling in a way he could not name. He told himself it was simply the natural coldness that follows a public embarrassment, that Lucia was punishing him in her own quiet way, and that it would pass once the gossip died down. Chiara, for her part, had begun to feel the first genuine cracks in her confidence about the life she was building with Massimo. She had imagined, when their affair began, a future of galas and influence and a man who adored her without reservation. What she found instead, as the months wore on, was a man increasingly consumed by anxiety over business decisions that were not going his way, a man who spoke less and less of any future that included her name, and a man who, in his most honest moments, still seemed to be measuring his life against a marriage he claimed to have outgrown. "Do you ever think about her?" Chiara asked him one evening, curled beside him on the terrace of his penthouse, watching the city lights flicker below. "Who?" Massimo asked, though he knew exactly who she meant. "Your wife," Chiara said, careful to keep her voice light, though something guarded had crept into it. "You still wear your ring sometimes. I've noticed." Massimo looked down at his hand, surprised to find she was right, and had no answer that satisfied either of them. He changed the subject that night, and several nights after, but the question lingered in the space between them like a small crack spreading slowly across glass. Meanwhile, Antonio Moetti's business associates, the few who still handled the quiet affairs he had not fully relinquished, brought him troubling news about Alberini Holdings. Massimo had made two significant investment decisions in the past month that experienced men in the city considered reckless, decisions that suggested a mind distracted by something far larger than spreadsheets and shareholder meetings. Antonio listened to the reports with the same careful attention he gave everything, and though he said nothing to Lucia about the state of her husband's company, he found himself, against his own better judgment, hoping that whatever storm was gathering around Massimo Alberini would not reach the woman who had finally, slowly, begun to smile again. He had not set out to fall in love with Lucia Alberini. He had set out, 30 years earlier, to honor a debt of kindness owed to a dying woman's memory. But sitting across from Lucia one grey Thursday morning, watching her describe the painting she was working on with more passion than he had heard in her voice about anything else, Antonio understood, quietly and without alarm, that something in him had shifted from gratitude into something far deeper, and far more dangerous to the careful distance he had always kept. The decision did not arrive as a single dramatic moment, the way Lucia had once imagined a decision like this might. There was no final betrayal caught in the act, no screaming match that ended a marriage in one violent night. Instead, it arrived quietly, over the course of an ordinary Tuesday morning, while Lucia stood in her garden pulling weeds from around the roses she had recently replanted, and realized with sudden, calm clarity that she had not thought about Massimo's opinion of her in nearly 2 weeks. The realization did not feel like loss. It felt like relief so total that she had to sit down on the garden bench and simply breathe for a moment, letting the truth settle over her the way morning fog settles over grass. She was not staying in her marriage out of love anymore, and she had not been for longer than she wanted to admit. She was staying out of habit, out of fear of what a life without the Alberini name might look like at 58, out of the quiet terror that leaving would mean admitting that 39 years of devotion had not been enough to keep the man she married from becoming someone who could humiliate her in front of strangers. That evening, when Massimo came home later than usual, smelling faintly of a cologne Lucia did not recognize, she was waiting for him in the study, not with tears or accusations, but with a folder of papers she had spent the afternoon preparing with the help of a lawyer Donatella had recommended. "I want a divorce, Massimo," she said, and her voice did not shake. He stared at her, and for a moment, something like panic flickered across his face, quickly replaced by the practiced composure of a man who had spent 30 years negotiating from a position of control. "Lucia, be reasonable. Whatever happened at the gala, I've apologized." "You never apologized," Lucia said quietly. "Not once. Not that night, not the morning after, not in the 3 months since. And I stopped waiting for you to. This is about him, isn't it?" Massimo's voice sharpened, some old jealousy surfacing despite his own affair, despite every right he had forfeited to feel betrayed. "The Moetti man. People have seen you together at that cafe." Lucia looked at him steadily, and in that look was 39 years of patience finally reaching its end. "This isn't about Antonio Moetti, Massimo. I want you to understand that clearly, because I need you to hear it once in your life without twisting it into something easier for you to be angry about. This is about me finally remembering that I deserve to be looked at the way I used to look at you, back when I believed you were the kind of man who would never make me feel small in a room full of strangers. You made me that man's punchline, Massimo. And I am done waiting for you to remember who I was before you decided I had grown too old to matter. Massimo had no answer for that. He watched her rise from the chair, place the folder gently on the desk between them, and walk out of the study with the same straight-backed grace she had carried out of the Sovrano ballroom months earlier, and for the first time in their entire marriage, he understood that he had lost something he would not get back simply by asking nicely. The weeks that followed brought a swift unraveling that Massimo had not fully prepared for. Word of the divorce spread quickly, and with it came a fresh wave of scrutiny into his business practices, timed with terrible precision alongside the fallout from his reckless recent investments. Two major partners quietly withdrew their support. His own board, sensing weakness, began murmuring about restructuring leadership. Chiara, watching the empire she had once found so intoxicating begin to wobble, found her feelings shifting from infatuation into something closer to calculation, quietly exploring what her options might look like if Massimo Alberini's name stopped opening the doors it once had. Lucia knew none of the details of his business troubles, and would not have taken satisfaction in them even if she had. She was too occupied with the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding a life on her own terms, moving into a smaller but sunlit apartment near the gardens, finishing her first real painting in 30 years, and discovering, morning by morning, that she did not need anyone's permission to take up space in the world. Antonio did not press her during those weeks, though he was never far. He helped her move a few boxes when her sons were too far away to do it themselves. He sat with her once, in comfortable silence, when the finality of the divorce papers left her more shaken than she expected. He never once suggested that her newfound freedom should lead anywhere in particular, and it was precisely that patience, that refusal to rush her healing for his own benefit, that told Lucia more clearly than any declaration could have that whatever was growing between them was built on something far sturdier than the infatuation that had once destroyed her marriage. Spring arrived gently that year, and with it came a change in Lucia's small apartment near the botanical gardens, where fresh canvases now leaned against the walls and cut roses from her new garden sat in vases on every windowsill. She had grown, in the months since her divorce was finalized, into a version of herself she barely recognized from the woman who had once shattered a champagne glass on the marble floor of the Sovrano ballroom. She laughed easily now. She spoke her mind without apologizing for it first. And she had begun to admit to herself, in quiet moments, that her feelings for Antonio Moetti had grown into something far beyond gratitude for a kind dance and steady company. It was Antonio who finally said it aloud, on an evening in late April when he had invited her to a quiet dinner at his home overlooking the sea, a home Lucia had never visited despite the many months of their careful, unhurried friendship. He had cooked the meal himself, something she had not expected from a man of his reputation, and over the last course, as the candlelight flickered between them, he set down his glass and looked at her with the same steady attention he had given her since the night of the gala. "I have known you, in some fashion, for nearly 30 years, Lucia," he said. "I watched you care for my wife when she was dying, without ever once asking for anything in return. I watched you build a life you were proud of, and I watched, from a distance I chose to keep out of respect, when that life began to unravel. I told myself for years that what I felt for you was simply admiration, simply a debt of gratitude I could never fully repay. I no longer believe that is the whole truth." Lucia sat very still, her heart beating with a nervousness she had not felt in decades, the particular fear of a woman who has been hurt badly enough to distrust even the gentlest offering of the heart. "Antonio, I am not asking you for anything you are not ready to give," he continued, his voice softening. "I have watched too many people rush love and ruin it before it had the chance to become something real. But I want you to know that what I feel for you is not new, and it is not fleeting, and it has nothing to do with pity for what that man put you through. I think you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, and I have known you long enough to be certain that has nothing to do with the color of your hair or the years on your hands." Tears gathered in Lucia's eyes, though for the first time in a long while, they were not tears of humiliation or grief. "I stopped believing anyone could look at me the way you just described," she said quietly. "I had convinced myself that after a certain age, a woman simply becomes invisible, that love was something reserved for the young and the untouched by disappointment. You've made me question that. Then let me spend the rest of whatever years I have left proving you wrong about it," Antonio said, reaching across the table to take her hand, gently, the way he had held it during their first dance months earlier. Their romance, once it finally bloomed, did not arrive with the reckless urgency of youth, but with the deliberate, treasured pace of two people who understood exactly how precious time became once you had lived long enough to know how easily it could be wasted. They took long walks through the gardens where they had first rebuilt their friendship. They attended small dinners with Lucia's sons, who found in Antonio a quiet, steady presence that eased their worry over their mother's happiness. Antonio, in turn, introduced Lucia to old friends who had known him since before Serena's passing, friends who watched him laugh more freely than they had seen in 30 years and understood, without needing to be told, exactly what Lucia Alberini had come to mean to him. Massimo's world, meanwhile, continued its slow collapse. The reckless investments that had marked his final months with Lucia proved as disastrous as his board had feared, and by early summer, Alberini Holdings had been forced into a painful restructuring that stripped Massimo of much of the control he had spent 30 years building. Chiara, sensing the shifting tides with the same sharp instincts that had drawn her to him in the first place, ended their relationship quietly over dinner, telling him with more honesty than he expected that she had realized somewhere along the way she had fallen in love with the version of him that no longer existed, the successful, confident man rather than the anxious, diminished one he had become. Alone in his mansion that summer, surrounded by rooms that had once been full of a life he had taken for granted, Massimo finally allowed himself to sit with the full weight of what he had lost, and for the first time since the night of the gala, he wept. The Fondation Ricci charity gala had been a fixture on the city's calendar for as long as Massimo Alberini could remember attending it, and even in the diminished state of his business, he had not been able to bring himself to skip it this year. Perhaps some part of him hoped that showing his face among the same circles that had watched his humiliation and his downfall would prove he was still a man worth respecting. Perhaps some part of him simply had nowhere else he wanted to be. Either way, he arrived alone, in a suit that fit slightly looser than it once had, and found himself standing near the same kind of marble floor where his old life had begun to unravel a year earlier. He saw her before she saw him. Lucia stood near the center of the room in a deep emerald gown, her silver hair swept elegantly back, laughing at something being said by an elderly woman beside her. She looked, Massimo thought with an ache he had not expected, more radiant than he had ever managed to make her feel in 39 years of marriage. And then Antonio Moetti appeared at her side, offering her a glass of wine with the easy familiarity of a man who had learned every one of her small preferences, and Lucia's face lit up in a way Massimo had not seen directed at him in over a decade, if ever. He watched them for a long moment from across the room, and in that moment, every excuse he had told himself over the past year crumbled away. He had told himself Lucia's silver hair and the lines around her eyes had simply stopped being beautiful to him, as though beauty were a fixed thing that faded on a schedule rather than something a man chooses, day after day, to keep seeing. He had told himself Chiara's youth offered something Lucia no longer could, without ever asking himself what, exactly, 39 years of shared history and quiet devotion was supposed to be worth if not more than that. Watching Antonio lead Lucia onto the dance floor now, watching the tenderness in the older man's hands and the trust in Lucia's eyes, Massimo finally understood, with the clarity that only comes too late, that he had not lost his wife to another man. He had lost her long before Antonio Moetti ever crossed that ballroom floor, the moment he decided her aging was something to be ashamed of instead of something to be honored. He did not approach them. There was nothing left to say that would undo what he had done, and some part of him, the part that still retained a shred of the dignity Lucia had once loved in him, understood that interrupting her happiness now would only prove, once again, that he had never truly deserved it. Instead, he watched from a distance as Antonio Moetti dipped his head to say something that made Lucia laugh, watched as the two of them moved together with the unhurried grace of two people who had found, late in life, something rarer than youth or wealth or status. He watched, and for the first time in his life, Massimo Alberini allowed himself to simply feel the full weight of his own regret, without excuses, without deflection, without anyone else to blame. Lucia noticed him near the edge of the room sometime later, standing alone with a drink he was not really drinking, and for a moment their eyes met across the space that had once held their entire marriage. She did not feel anger anymore, standing there in Antonio's arms. She did not feel the need for an apology she knew, by now, would never truly come. She felt only a quiet, settled peace, the particular peace of a woman who has stopped needing anything from the person who once made her feel small, because she had finally found everything she needed in herself, and in a man who had never once made her doubt her own worth. She gave Massimo the smallest of nods, not cruel, not triumphant, simply an acknowledgement that their story, whatever it had once been, was now firmly in the past. Then she turned back to Antonio, resting her head against his shoulder as the music continued, and let herself be fully present in the life she had built. Years later, when Lucia would tell the story of that gala to her granddaughters, she would not dwell on Massimo's humiliation or her own heartbreak. She would tell them, instead, about the 60-year-old man who crossed a crowded ballroom to ask a stranger to dance, not because he pitied her, but because he saw in her exactly what 39 years of marriage had taught her husband to overlook. She would tell them that real love, the kind that lasts, has nothing to do with the smoothness of your skin or the color of your hair, and everything to do with being seen, fully and without condition, by someone who chooses you again every single day. And on quiet evenings, when Antonio took her hand and asked, as he still did after all their years together, "May I have this dance?" Lucia would smile the same way she had smiled that very first night, grateful that some love stories, contrary to everything the world tries to tell us, only grow more beautiful with time. Thank you so much for spending this time with Lucia and Antonio's story. If it touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to know which part of their journey moved you the most. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue bringing you heartfelt, mature love stories like this one. We hope you will join us again soon for another story of second chances, healing, and love that knows no age. Until next time, take care of yourselves and never stop believing in the beauty of love, at any age.